I am going to give a brief introduction to our speaker, Dr. Alexandra Adams. Thank you so much for being here today from overseas and calling in early there, as it is earlier there than it is here, for sure. So thank you. If you guys don't know already, Dr. Alexandra Adams has worked in partnership with multiple Native American communities for over 25 years to promote family and community health and wellness using both scientific rigor and crucial community knowledge. She also works on the effects of climate change in human health, recently producing the Montana Climate Change and Human Health Report, which I believe most of you have seen or heard of, and you can access this at www.c2h2.org. She also uses storytelling, filmmaking, and other outreach strategies to engage communities and impact health. She currently serves as the director of the Center for American Indian and Rural Health Equity at Montana State University, an NIH-funded center focusing on building research partnerships with rural and Native communities and mentoring junior investigators. And Alex, I will let you go ahead and get started.
It's 7 a.m. in Aotearoa, New Zealand here for me. And so I've got an interesting background because it's still dark out here. So it's lovely to see everybody. I guess it's about noon your time. And I just really grateful for everybody being here. Thanks. We're going to hopefully do a fairly short talk and then maybe have some discussion if we can do that. We'll see how it. So I wanted to do a little bit of an introduction that is more of an Indigenous introduction. If I was introducing myself in one of my Indigenous languages, which I don't have, I would, people usually introduce themselves by their, what down here is called their whakapapa or their genealogy. But my genealogy is European American. I hail from the Atlantic side of the continent. When I'm in the States, I came from the East Coast and I now live obviously in Montana. And so my sea really is the Atlantic, but my mountain right now is Mount Ellis because I get to see that all the time and I really enjoy seeing that. As I said, I'm currently in New Zealand. I'm on a Fulbright and I'm near the South Pacific, which has been a real joy. I'm going to share my screen now and get started with the presentation. So I always want to acknowledge all the different Indigenous communities that have ancestral ties to the land now occupied by MSU, where we are all working and whose relationships with that land date back for many, many centuries, and whose connection is still very strong to their place and their land. So these are the partnerships that I've had in the past, and many are still current. I just want to also thank all of the Native American communities that I've worked with over many years. And my funding agency, my funders have primarily been NIH, NHLBI, NCI, and NIGMS, which funds our COBRE Center here at MSU. So I'm going to start with three critical issues that the Rockefeller-Lancet Commission laid out in 2015 as some of the issues that we're dealing with when we think about planetary health. And I really like to look at these because I feel that they are super important for how we think about, just gonna hide that window so I can see it, how we think about what we do when we work on the environment and climate change and human health. And these are how we think and relate our conceptual and empathy failures, what we know, knowledge failures, and implementation failures, and then what we do with all of that. And I like to think of these as crises of imagination and mindset. And we're going to talk through how I have come to understand that my Indigenous friends know a lot more about how to think and relate in terms of how they work with the land than many of us do. And obviously not all of us, but than many of us do. And it changed my way of thinking about health drastically. And I think it's an important concept to try and get across. Why am I not going to the next one here? There we go. So I'm going to tell my story because I think it's really important to explain sort of how I got to where I am a little bit and how I moved from being as a physician and a public health researcher really into thinking about planetary health. I started out working with Native communities to working on preventing childhood obesity because of the high rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease in these communities. And we started out together with multiple communities in Wisconsin, where I worked at the UW for many years, looking at what will most benefit individuals and families in order to make them healthier. And what does the community think will work best, and how do they want to do that? And it turned out they wanted to work with young children, ages 3 to 5. This is one of the families in one of my early studies. And that led into a lot of work that's still ongoing, but it also led into looking at what is the role of adverse childhood experiences and trauma in looking at chronic disease. We looked at obvious things like physical activity and diet and exercise and all of that, but underlying that was trauma. And we came up with this model, which is called the Menominee Trauma Model, which we took to understand that historic trauma, loss of language and culture in the communities, loss of their land base, and the community, in Menominee's case, the termination of their tribe at one point and having to reclaim that, the boarding school area, and genocide over centuries led to a lot of this pain, fear, anger, racism, stereotyping, etc., creating current community norms of intergenerational risk, lateral violence, acceptance of dysfunction, and kind of a survival mode and severe poverty. These kind of came together to create adverse childhood experiences. And then in order for people to handle those things, they have chosen unhealthy behaviors a lot of times. Substance use, suicide, abuse, lack of self-care, and a big disconnection even with their own environment and an unhealthy community. So in looking at that, we were then invited to go to New Zealand in 2017 to do an Indigenous knowledge exchange about childhood obesity prevention, looking at community-based approaches and partnering with Indigenous communities. And what we realized from going on that trip, I had one of my Menominee friends with me, was that the Maori had already shifted their thinking around wellness promotion. Instead of looking at it from individual behavior or even community-based behaviors, to looking at it through how do we revitalize and heal. And we'd already been thinking about this, but how do we heal a lot of that trauma, both the current trauma as well as some of the historic trauma, and shifting much more into a language and culture and kinship revitalization. The other thing that we came to understand by spending a lot of time outside over the many different knowledge exchanges we've had up until this year, was that the view of health is not individual or even community health. It's really the health of the land, so that people were much more engaged if they were out on the land and in the land, working to understand their own culture, their own connection to land, their own language, and their own kinship to that land. And then health was kind of a secondary outcome rather than thinking at it from a primary outcome. So it's a very different sort of shift. It's really shifting towards how do we put the land first and the people second, because the land is the most important thing. So then we came up with the Menominee Wellness Model, and they have begun significant inroads into embracing and doing much more language immersion, revitalizing their culture, and reclaiming their identity as Menominee people in a much stronger way. And this is happening across Indian country. I'm using Menominee as an example because I've done the most work with the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. They did a lot of work on trauma-informed care and building healthy relationships and creating new traditions, such as instead of just handing out seed packets or seed starters for community gardens, really getting together and doing a traditional blessing of the seeds, teaching younger people about the meaning of seeds, doing a seed bank for traditional seeds, etc., in order to really reclaim a lot of the understanding and pieces of seeds that would have been done traditionally. That has both strengthened their community and increased positive childhood experiences, which are important for healing. That gets into the community wellness piece. And that's kind of where I was in around maybe 2018, 2019. and working with different communities around the country on promoting a family and community wellness, which is work that we still do. However, as you may remember, this is one of the big fires that we had that affected our community. And when I moved to Montana, I learned about fire season, and we've had some really bad fire seasons. Particularly, I think one of the bad ones was before COVID and even during COVID. And then we had, of course, all of the bad flooding. And then, so this really started to shift my thinking from really thinking about, as a physician and researcher, family and community health, to what is the health of the planet and how are we thinking collectively about planetary health. So I was invited in, I guess it was 2020, during the COVID epidemic, to gather with a number of people. This was before COVID, and then we wrote it during COVID, together with a number of people to talk about what was happening in Montana and how it's happening faster. And obviously, Kathy Whitlock and Bruce Maxwell of IOE had already been doing a lot of work in this area and had already written a climate change report in Montana, but we hadn't linked it to human health. So we had public health folks, we had the Byrons, which are physicians working heavily in this area, and others come together to write this report, and really helped open my eyes much more to what was happening on the ground in Montana and with different kinds of communities in Montana, and how rural communities are being much more severely affected. So what we know is that rural communities experience the higher levels of exposure to climate change because of their unique characteristics. You know, they're outside more, they may have more poverty, they have health literacy and health access issues that are significant. But we don't really understand what their resilience is, what their adaptive capacity is, who's got plans, who doesn't. And of course, it differs among age groups, race, ethnicity groups, gender, income, etc. We also know worldwide, Indigenous communities face higher levels of climate change impact given their connection to the land, their access to natural resources, which have been constrained or taken away in many areas, and their cultures that are very dependent on traditional ways and traditional calendars and cycles of seasonality, which are now drastically shifting. So this is an example of one climate change adaptation plan that the Blackfeet Nation has. Flathead also has a good one, and I believe there's one other in the state, and it's either Rocky Boy or Fort Belknap, and I'm sorry, I can't remember this morning. But there are about 150 tribes across the country that do have good climate change adaptation plans. Not all of them have that, but I think one thing that distinguishes the tribal communities in the United States is even if they don't have the plans, they're often way ahead of many rural communities in terms of thinking and understanding that climate change is a significant issue for their communities. So again, we get back to these three critical issues. And what I'm seeing as I work now in the National Academy in the climate change kind of group is that there's a lot of knowledge out there about what's happening with climate change, about the economic impacts, the environmental impacts, the environmental degradation that's happening alongside all of the sort of 9 critical sort of planetary things that are going on. But there's a lot of conceptual and empathy failures about how to think about these things, and people are feeling very stuck in a lot of ways. And then often there's implementation failures, particularly at the political level. And I believe that's because we're in this crisis of mindset rather than crisis of knowledge. So these are the common questions I get when I have presented. I presented to the London School of Hygiene and Public Health last summer about Indigenous knowledge and how it was important in understanding planetary health. And the common questions I get are, how do we begin to decolonize? How do we connect better with nature? And why is Indigenous knowledge important to science and planetary health? And so I'm going to not answer all of those because they're really big questions. And I think I'm going to sort of touch on some of these, but I think that some better questions that I got asked, how do Indigenous communities' conceptions of health and well-being, how could they benefit human and planetary health? And what is the trauma relationship with their trauma and the trauma that we are currently going through the destruction of environment and these numbers of planetary boundaries that we could talk about better. And then what ancestral wisdom teach us about the power of community for healing broken systems? And these are better questions. And I'm sitting with these questions here, and we sat with them at our summit, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the answers that are emerging. So my questions, I think, coming here and sort of overall in terms of thinking about how knowledge is on our planet and how we can best utilize the different kinds of knowledges and understandings and worldviews is how do the different worldviews and ways of knowing, how do they help us work together in this crisis? And who may be ready to listen to different ways of thinking and knowing, and what questions are they asking, like I just showed you, and what is the story that we're living under that really isn't working? Because I think that from our earliest days as children to now, most of the way we learn is through story, whether it's a research story with data behind it that we have created. Here's the story of my work. Here's the story of what I'm studying, or whether it's an actual story or whether it's an ancestral story. What is the story, or what are the stories that we're living under that really aren't working for us right now? And so the story that I see that we're living under is the story of separation. And Einstein talks about this beautifully in his book. Eisenstein, sorry. What is this? The story of sort of individualism, colonialism, and many other isms, capitalism being the biggest one probably. And those stories that say that we're sort of in it alone, that we have to do it ourselves, are really problematic and are really causing our climate disruption and ecosystem disruption. And my sense from many years of doing this work with Indigenous communities and partnering with them and learning so much from my Maori colleagues down here is that we need a new story, and yet it's also an older story. And that's the story of community, kinship, and belonging. And that we need to think carefully and together about how we're going to shift our thinking, because we need that new story, that new vision that's going to inspire us and that's going to really help us ask better questions and propose better solutions. Because if you're asking from a individualistic separation capitalism lens, it's a very different set of questions that you're asking, carbon taxes and it's all about money, than a question you're asking if we're all one community and the earth is us and we are the earth. Those are very different worldviews. So we're going to talk through that just a little bit. So I want to just go through some very basic differences between Western and Indigenous ways of thinking, ways of learning, and ways of collecting data, if you will, or understanding the earth. And Western knowledge, while it can be really great, it tends to be very exclusive. It tends to be very individual, or even in a lab. Western culture is about land ownership, and our power comes from independence. Man is also often seen as the highest form of life, having dominion over other forms of life. We place a lot of value on numeric data or quantitative understanding, and again, the story of separation. Indigenous communities tend to be inclusive and collective. Land is relationship, and land is usually often capitalized with an L because it is a relationship. It is part of who they are and also something they have respect for. And their power comes from generosity, and man is part of a very intricate web of responsibility and caretaking for the earth. And story and language and long-term generations of data collection through story and through language are encoded in their culture, especially more intact cultures. And theirs is a much more of a story of belonging or kinship. So I just want you to read this. This is thanks to Stephen Davis, who's one of our assistant deans in the honors college here, and he's Blackfoot. And I think it helps understand the difference in the way thinking begins and knowledge is created, particularly in the Blackfoot people. So one of the beautiful analogies that Stephen uses, and I'm going to credit him, but it's a lovely one, is the Plains Indians had a common sign language so they could speak to each other, even though many of them obviously had different languages. And one of them is their word for mountain in sign, which is this, which Stephen tells me dates back to the very earliest understanding of how the Rocky Mountains were created with the shift of the tectonic plates and the upswelling of mountains, which can only happen over thousands of years of learning and observation on the land. So the other person I want to thank for teaching me a lot is Emily Salloway. And Emily Salloway is also Blackfoot. She's an elder that works in our center. And Emily teaches a lot about how to work with communities in good ways, and how to build trust with communities, and how to honor the work together as our partners with Indigenous communities. And she talks about the 3 R's, and I always add one that Emily embodies but doesn't always speak about, and they are respect, relationship, reciprocity, and reverence. And I think these go both for speaking with how we approach working with Indigenous communities, but also how we need to think about our relationship to land with that capital L. And this is really how she approaches sort of everything. How do we build respect among people? How do we respect the land that we're on and the ecosystem and environments that we're in relationship with? And what is our reciprocity for that? And that's all built out of a deep reverence for community. So here's another quote from Chief Luther Standing Bear, who's Sioux, and again gets into that kinship principle. Kinship with all creatures of the earth, sky, and water was, and I would say is, a real and active principle. This concept of life and all its relations, which is a concept I use called all my relations, creates reverence again and makes a place for all things in the scheme of existence with equal importance to all things, understanding that one thread is important to all. And I think obviously we have many examples of that in environmental work with ecosystems, and how removal of one species can cause demise of many parts of a single ecosystem. So I'm here on a New Zealand, on a Fulbright to New Zealand now. And one of the things that we did when I was down here is hold a summit called Climate Change, Indigenous Knowledge, and Planetary Health Summit. I would just want to talk through that a little bit and what we did, and kind of ask you to sort of keep the question in mind is, how could Indigenous knowledge, or the shift, this paradigm shift in thinking towards the relationship, reciprocity, respect, and reverence we need to have with our current environment and the current land, really assist you what you're studying and researching. And I'll try to give a few specific examples of Indigenous knowledge, but because it tends to be broad and local, I'm really more on the thinking about the conceptual pieces. So it was held in the Apawana Marae in Rotorua down here in New Zealand, and we had a number of different folks from the United States come. We had, I want to say, 15 people come from the US. We had 5 from the Menominee Nation, which is a nation in the middle of Wisconsin that has one of the longest and most sustainably harvested forests in the world. And people come internationally to visit that forest and learn about how they have kept a huge diversity of forest going while using it as an income source and sustainably harvesting it by individual cutting and the way they've managed that forest. We had a number of people from Blackfeet come. I want to say 6 or 7 people, can't remember, losing count now. But we had 2 elders come as our elder language specialists and teachers. We had a language immersion teacher. We had Stephen come as a scientist and engineer, and Stephen's wife and others. And then we had a number of participants from local Maori communities, Maori scientific folks, as well as a few Western academics. And I'm just going to share some very preliminary outcomes of this and some pictures, just because that's always nice to see pictures. This is one of our sharing circles, which we held in the afternoon after all of the presentations or outdoor work in order to discuss and have questions. So this was primarily an Indigenous group. I want to say there were probably 4 or 5 of us that were non-Indigenous. So one of the big themes that came out, and this is Smokey and Darnell presenting inside the marae. They're wearing their traditional garb because we had been invited to do that at a number of different points during the conference, and so they did that. This is the outside of the marae, Apamana Marae, and a marae is a complex of buildings that is used to host visitors, celebrations, ceremonies, funerals, etc. It consists of that central building that I'm showing you there with intricate carvings both inside and outside and paintings. Each of those carvings and paintings and even weavings, even though they look like just designs, actually hold story. So there's a lot of language encoded and knowledge encoded in that entire building. In fact, the structure itself has a very detailed story that explains why it's designed like that and how it holds knowledge. And so what I'm coming to see is that there are so many layers of meaning in Indigenous language that you barely scratch the surface understanding some words. So one of the big themes that came out of this is about walking backwards into future and the importance of understanding our ancestral knowledge, the old stories, the traditional knowledge that dates back generations and generations as holding many of the answers we need now into the future. And not just the 500-year stories, but the ones that go back prior to colonization in many of these communities. And language often has stories encoded within it. So for example, in Menominee, there might be a word that might be the word strawberry means the berry that you pick and that's, that's red and heart-shaped, but it also means a berry that is good for your heart and that brings people together because people pick it together, and that it comes in the springtime or in early June, and it's associated with a particular kind of moon, and that gets into an entire story and genealogy of how peoples are connected to the land. And so those, and that's just a very, very basic understanding of mine. There's probably many more layers. So each of those words has many stories and pieces behind it. And Maori is an exceptional language in that case, in that each vowel in each word also has its encoded meaning. And those encoded meanings often tell stories that connect to some aspect of the land that people could understand. The other thing that came out, this is Fallon presenting a lovely Maori woman who's very politically active in her communities. The importance of the paradigm shift we've been talking about of changing people and how thinking needs to be shifted. And then again, as I've spoken about the importance of Indigenous language preservation, because we lose Indigenous languages at a very high rate. And preservation of Indigenous language has been associated actually with environmental diversity. So diversity of languages is actually associated with diversity of the environment, in the environment. And many of those languages encode ways of understanding and taking care of those local environments. So very important for not only cultural and spiritual health, but also environmental health. So we talked a lot about language nests and language immersion and really maintaining language. The other piece that came out is that we are a part of nature, not apart from nature, and that's an important concept. So connecting to nature is really learning how to connect to ourselves, learning how to listen to the land over long periods of time, but also just getting out into the land. So many of the things that we did were not only within the marae, but also outside. So this is Dr. Jonathan Patz from the University of Wisconsin. He's a National Academy of Medicine member on that climate change group and health group, as I described earlier. And he's learning about traditional Indigenous foods outside in one of the gardens and talking about that. And then here's another picture. This is my friend Ihi Heki here, who's speaking about traditional forests. And we are out in the forest, learning about the forest in the forest. And one of the things that I think is really important is when we're speaking or talking about the environment, that we actually get out into the environment and listen to what it is also speaking to us as we are in that environment, because things that are said and shared in the environment and outside become much richer and more deep when we're outdoors in it than when we are experiencing it and understanding and seeing firsthand than when we're sitting in classrooms or other kinds of rooms like that. So there's also a significant difference between, as I've been speaking about, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing things, and then local place-based Indigenous knowledge. And so that's kind of the uber, like this is the way of thinking and understanding the world as kinship and connection in those 4 R's we talked about. But there's also really specific local place-based Indigenous knowledge. And one of the beautiful teachings that they have, that the Maori have, and that we heard about from one of the women who I don't have a picture of, was something called Maramataka. And Maramataka is a system of understanding the seasonality locally, as well as sort of around this entire island, about from the moon cycles, and looking at the different moon cycles and then understanding how that affected plants and animals, and both on the sea and on the land, and when was good to harvest, when was good to plant, when was good to fish, when was not good to do those kinds of things. And the interesting thing is that those moon cycles are related to 3-year star cycles. They're related to sort of daily cycles during out the day, as well as a monthly cycle. And there's a lot of deep knowledge that I think is more generalizable, but there's also very deep local knowledge that has to be understood at the local level. So for example, looking at one example Ihi shares is, how high are the spiders spinning their webs? And if they're spinning them low to the ground, there'll be less rain this year. If they're spinning them higher up, there'll be more rain this year. And so these kinds of very localized, specific knowledge with specific animals, plants, insects, etc., need to be observed locally over time. And the rapidity of those observations obviously is changing as climate change happens. But understanding how to do that, and how to do that in a way that leads to further knowledge, is really important. So we started to think about what are sort of generalizable knowledge pieces and what is a way of looking at things that can be used locally and enhanced locally for local understanding. So this is one of the themes that I had, and I'm going to really butcher the Maori, but kotau roru, kotaku roru, kaora ate iwi. With your food basket and my food basket, we will prosper. So we talked a lot about how weaving Western science and Indigenous ways of understanding and knowing and observing over time, weaving those kinds of understandings together is really where we need to be headed. So I'm going to say thank you and move to questions. And the C2H2 is on that site. And not only do we have the report on that site, but we also have 4 films made by a beautiful young filmmaker. One is on health, and so she got 4 films. Let's see. One is on, I want to say it's like about the health of the environment on the Flathead Reservation, and how they're restoring the white bark pine using both Western and Indigenous methods. She's got one on children and the effects in Missoula on lung health in the preschools. She's got one. We have one on what physicians and health centers can do, and then we have really one on farming and ranching communities and mental health issues, and how climate change is going to be affecting those. So those are c2h2.org, and that's our website for CAIRHE, and that's me. And I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.